The 27th of May 1942 began like every other morning in the Libyan desert, with dust, heat, and the distant rumble of armor. Near the rocky escarpment of Ain el-Ghazala, a British 8th Army staff officer named Captain Peter Vaux was watching through his field glasses when something stopped him cold. A column of American-built Grant tanks had crested a ridge and opened fire on a German panzer formation below. The range was good. The guns were firing. And then, with methodical, almost contemptuous precision, the German column pivoted, not to flee, not to scatter, but to maneuver. Within 11 minutes, 3 of the Grants were burning. The rest reversed over the ridge in disarray. Vaux lowered his glasses and said nothing for a long moment. He had expected a fight. What he had witnessed was something closer to an execution, and the executioner had not been the machine with the better gun. What made that scene extraordinary was not the outcome. British and Commonwealth armored forces had suffered painful losses to German panzers before. What made it extraordinary was the context. The Grant tank was, by almost every technical metric available in 1942, a serious weapon. It mounted a 75mm gun capable of penetrating German armor at battle ranges. It was mechanically robust, well armored for its class, and had been greeted with something approaching relief when it arrived in North Africa earlier that year. The Americans who supplied it, and many of the British officers who received it, believed it represented a turning point. Rommel's headquarters, upon learning of its arrival, reportedly took careful note. And yet, on that morning and on dozens of mornings like it across the western desert, the Grant and its successors were being defeated not primarily by superior German steel, but by superior German, and more importantly, British, tactical thinking. The machine mattered less than the method. And it was the British method, refined through failure and hard desert schooling, that Erwin Rommel would ultimately identify as his most dangerous opponent. To understand why, one must go back not to the tanks themselves, but to the philosophy that governed how armor was used. In 1940 and into 1941, the British Western Desert Force operated under a doctrine that had been inherited, more or less intact, from the cavalry traditions of a previous century. Armor was to be used boldly, offensively, in sweeping charges that would unhinge the enemy line. The tank was a weapon of exploitation, meant to pour through gaps and run free. This was not entirely wrong as a concept, but it was catastrophically wrong as a practice when applied without coordination with infantry, artillery, and anti-tank screens. The result was a series of tactical disasters that became grimly familiar to anyone who studied the early desert campaign. British armored brigades would charge German positions, encounter concealed 88mm anti-tank guns they had not reconnoitered, and be destroyed piecemeal. The tanks would burn. The crews would die. And the German line would hold, or better still, advance. What makes this painful period historically significant is not the failures themselves but the process of learning that emerged from them. The architects of that learning were not always senior officers with grand reputations. They were often junior commanders and staff officers who survived long enough to analyze what was going wrong and who possessed the institutional courage to say so clearly. Brigadier Jock Campbell, who would win the Victoria Cross at Sidi Rezegh and die in a vehicle accident before seeing the full fruit of his influence, was among the first to articulate a combined arms philosophy in the desert context. Campbell's battle groups, named Jock columns in his honor, were improvised all-arms formations that paired armor with artillery and infantry, something the British cavalry doctrine had persistently resisted. They were not always effective. They were sometimes too small to be decisive. But they represented a conceptual break with the old orthodoxy that would prove enormously consequential. The process accelerated under Lieutenant General William Gott, under Major General Frank Messervy, and ultimately under generals who learned to think less about the tank as a weapon in isolation and more about the battle as a system. This systemic thinking, the integration of reconnaissance, artillery, infantry, logistics, and armor into a coherent operational whole, was precisely what distinguished the British adaptation from the American approach that arrived in North Africa in late 1942. The Americans came with newer equipment, greater industrial capacity, and enormous energy. They also came with a doctrine that had not yet been tested against Rommel's Afrika Korps, and which therefore replicated, with painful fidelity, many of the errors the British had already made and discarded. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 illustrated this difference with brutal clarity. American forces, encountering a determined German offensive through the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia, were caught repeatedly in the posture that British experience had taught was suicidal. Armor unsupported by coordinated artillery and infantry, advancing against prepared positions without adequate reconnaissance, with supply lines poorly organized and command structures that had not been tested under fire. The result was the worst American defeat of the entire North African campaign. 6,500 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. Roughly 183 tanks were lost. The II Corps was driven back more than 80 kilometers in 2 days. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe. What made Kasserine instructive rather than merely tragic was the reaction it prompted. American commanders, from Eisenhower downward, undertook an honest and sometimes brutal reassessment. General George Patton, who took command of II Corps immediately after Kasserine, was ruthless in his imposition of discipline, training standards, and operational coherence. But the doctrine that was ultimately adopted, the methods that would carry American forces through Tunisia, Sicily, and into Northwest Europe, drew heavily on British desert experience. Not because the Americans lacked courage or competence, but because the British had paid for that experience in blood across 2 years of fighting that the Americans had not yet endured. Rommel himself, in his own campaign diaries and in the strategic assessments he submitted to OKH, the German Army High Command, drew a distinction between his British and American opponents that has sometimes been flattened by later commentary. Popular memory tends to portray Rommel as a commander who respected individual British units, the 7th Armoured Division, the Rifle Brigade, the 2nd New Zealand Division, whilst regarding the British command structure with contempt, and who greeted the American entry into the war with something approaching relief at facing a less experienced adversary. The reality recorded in his papers is more complicated, and considerably more respectful of what the British had actually achieved. In January 1943, with the Tunisian campaign entering its final phase and German supply lines strangling under Allied air and naval pressure, Rommel wrote an assessment that his Chief of Staff, Fritz Bayerlein, later recalled was unusually frank about the evolution of British operational method. Rommel noted that the British had, by the end of 1942, developed a capacity for all-arms coordination that consistently frustrated his ability to exploit tactical opportunities. When the panzers achieved a breakthrough, the British artillery, now positioned in depth and handled with disciplined aggression rather than the static thinking of earlier campaigns, would smother the follow-through. When German anti-tank screens sought to draw British armor onto prepared killing grounds, British commanders were increasingly reluctant to take the bait. The charge had given way to the methodical advance. The cavalry spirit had been replaced, painfully and at great cost, by professional combined arms thinking. This was not the picture of British military incompetence that popular writing about the Desert War so often portrays. It was, Rommel recognized, a transformation. And it was a transformation driven not by new equipment. The Americans had better tanks arriving throughout this period, but by accumulated operational wisdom that no amount of industrial production could substitute for. The specific incidents that documented this change in British method were numerous, but several stand out for their directness. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, which began on the 23rd of October 1942, Montgomery's 8th Army employed an artillery preparation of 882 guns firing in coordinated counter-battery and infantry support programs that suppressed German anti-tank screens long enough to allow infantry to clear the minefield lanes through which armor would advance. Previous British offensives had attempted to use armor to create the breakthrough and then rush infantry forward. Alamein reversed this sequence, deliberately and systematically. The tanks would not charge ahead of the artillery. The artillery would not be treated as a supporting arm subordinate to armored commanders who wanted to move fast. It would be the primary weapon, used in mass and with professional precision, and the tanks would consolidate what the guns had made possible. The 1st Armored Division's passage through the Australian sector on the night of the 1st and 2nd of November 1942 demonstrated how completely British armoured doctrine had been reformed. The tanks moved at infantry pace, in the dark, through cleared lanes, behind a rolling barrage, whilst engineers led them forward on foot using shaded torches. It was the antithesis of the cavalry charge. It was slow, methodical, and extraordinarily effective. When the German 15th Panzer Division counterattacked at dawn on the 2nd of November, they struck British armor that was already in position, already hull down, already coordinated with anti-tank guns and artillery. The Germans lost 70 tanks in that counterattack. British losses were comparatively modest. Rommel, observing from a position only 3 kilometers behind his front line that morning, later described watching the collapse of his armored reserve with a sense of helplessness that was alien to his earlier experience in the desert. His enemy had learned. The improvised charges, the unsupported armored thrusts, the gift of isolated formations strung out across open ground, these had disappeared. What replaced them was a professional, coordinated, systematic opponent who had absorbed the lessons of 2 years of defeat and transformed them into doctrine. The statistical record bears examination, because it complicates the simple narrative, in ways that matter. British tank losses throughout 1941 and the first half of 1942 were consistently higher than German losses in similar engagements, not because British tanks were technically inferior in every respect, but because British tactical method repeatedly presented German anti-tank gunners with optimal targets. A Matilda tank, which was effectively impenetrable to German guns in 1940 and early 1941, could still be destroyed if it was driven unsupported into a position where 88mm guns had been laid for it. The armor did not save the crew because the doctrine had not saved the armor. By contrast, in the period from August to November 1942, the months of the First Battle of El Alamein, Alam Halfa, and the Second El Alamein, British tank losses relative to ground gained and enemy losses shifted significantly. The 8th Army's ratio of tanks exchanged to kilometers of front consolidated improved by an estimated 40% between Operation Crusader in November 1941 and Operation Supercharge in November 1942. This was not primarily because British tanks had improved, though the introduction of the Grant and then the American Sherman provided genuine capability gains. It was because the method governing their employment had been transformed. American commanders arriving in North Africa encountered a British army that, in its better formations and under its better commanders, had genuinely solved problems that the Americans had not yet begun to face. This created a tension that shaped the entire Tunisian campaign. American doctrine, drawn from the tank-centric thinking that had developed in the interwar period and from the precepts of armored warfare advocates who had never fought in the desert, emphasized the tank as an instrument of deep exploitation. Coordination with infantry and artillery was acknowledged in principle. In practice, under the pressure of combat, and the urgency of commanders who had absorbed their doctrine in classrooms rather than in Cyrenaican sand, it often dissolved. General Lloyd Fredendall, who commanded 2 corps at Kasserine, was a textbook example of this theoretical confidence colliding with practical disaster. His dispositions before Kasserine violated almost every lesson the British had extracted from 2 years of fighting. He dispersed his forces, separated his armor from his artillery, failed to establish adequate defensive depth, and relied on formations that had not trained together to hold positions that required cohesive combined arms defense. When Rommel's forces struck with their characteristic concentrated speed, the dispersed and uncoordinated American line could not hold. The British liaison officers attached to 2 corps during Kasserine later wrote assessments that were sympathetic to the Americans' predicament but frank about its origins. Brigadier Charles Dunphy, who observed the battle directly, noted that the American armored commanders were attempting to fight in a manner that the British had found catastrophically inadequate 18 months earlier. The coordination of fire, movement, and protection. what the British had learned to call all-arms battle, was absent not because American soldiers lacked courage, but because American doctrine had not yet internalized its necessity. Rommel's respect for what the British had learned, by contrast, was grounded in hard operational experience. In his planning for Operation Theseus, the Gazala offensive of May and June 1942, he had been careful to estimate British tactical evolution as one of his key variables. His initial optimism about the offensive was tempered by what he described, in a letter to his wife Lucy on the 26th of May, as the British improving faster than I would like. When British combined arms groups at Burhatium and at Knightsbridge held for longer than his operational planning had assumed, it was this improvement he was observing. When the 4th Armored Brigade and the 1st South African Division exacted unexpectedly heavy costs from his armored sweeps in early June, it was not the equipment that was inflicting those costs but the disciplined integration of artillery fire with armored positioning that 2 years of bitter schooling had produced. There is a nuance here that deserves acknowledgement. The British adaptation was uneven, and it would be historically dishonest to present it as a uniform transformation. Commanders like Neil Ritchie, who led 8th Army through the disaster of the fall of Tobruk in June 1942, demonstrated that the old failures could recur even as better method was being developed elsewhere. Individual British armored formations, under pressure, still sometimes reverted to the unsupported charge. The institutional learning was real, but it was imperfectly distributed across a large army fighting in difficult circumstances with variable command quality. Moreover, the role of logistics, which Rommel himself consistently identified as his decisive vulnerability, should not be understated. By the autumn of 1942, the Afrika Korps was fighting at a severe material disadvantage. German tank losses were no longer being replaced at a rate that matched attrition. Fuel shortages were constraining operational tempo. The improvement in British tactical method occurred simultaneously with a deterioration in German material conditions, and it would be artificial to separate these two factors entirely. Better British doctrine would not have won the Desert War if German logistics had remained robust. What it did was ensure that when German material advantages were reduced, British operational efficiency was capable of exploiting that reduction. The post-war assessment of this period, conducted by both British and American military historians, was consistent in its central finding. The decisive factor in the 8th Army's transformation between 1941 and late 1942 was not equipment but doctrine. The Shermans and Grants mattered. The additional guns mattered. But the institutional capacity to integrate these weapons into a coherent combined arms system, to suppress, to fix, to flank, to exploit in a coordinated rather than an impulsive sequence, was the factor that turned material sufficiency into operational success. American doctrine underwent its own transformation after Kasserine, and it did so with remarkable speed. By the time of the Sicilian campaign in July 1943, American armored formations were fighting with a coordination and sophistication that bore little resemblance to their performance in Tunisia 5 months earlier. The lessons absorbed in North Africa were incorporated into doctrine, into training, and into the mindset of commanders who had been humbled enough by Kasserine to take British experience seriously. Bradley, Patton, and their subordinates proved capable of learning at a rate that would ultimately produce one of the most effective ground forces of the entire war. But it was the British who paid for the education, and it was the British method. The all-arms discipline, the artillery-centric approach to the offensive, the refusal to allow armor to operate unsupported, that Rommel identified as his most dangerous opponent in the theater where he earned his greatest fame. Not the grand tank. Not American industrial capacity. Not the material advantage that the Allied supply chain eventually produced. It was the method, evolved through painful failure and honest institutional reassessment, that earned Rommel's professional respect. In his final months commanding in North Africa, Rommel made a remark to Bayerlein that the latter recorded, and which has survived in the German operational records. He said that fighting the British in the desert was, by the end of 1942, like fighting an opponent who had learned every mistake you were counting on them to make and then stopped making them. The Americans, he observed, were still making the mistakes. But the British had learned. That learning was purchased at a price that is still difficult to fully reckon. Thousands of men burned in tanks, buried in desert, lost to wounds and heat and the specific misery of an armored battle in conditions designed to amplify every human vulnerability. What they bought with those losses was not merely victory in a particular theater. It was an institutional wisdom about the relationship between technology and method that would shape how Britain, America, and every major military power thought about armored warfare for the remainder of the century. The tank alone was never the answer. The system in which the tank operated, the coordination it achieved with every other arm, the doctrine that governed its employment, these were always the answer. Rommel knew it. The British, eventually, proved it.